This is not just a day of policy conversation. I want to be very clear about that. Everybody talks about January 6, J6. What happened on January 6? I would posit to you that the most important January 6 in American history didn't come in 2021. It came in 1915. But not a lot of people know about it. On January 6, 1915, a group of Carrancista partisans, participants in the Mexican Revolution of the era, who were adherents of the cause of Venustiano Carranza, who was the eventual victor of the revolution, until his general shot him, by the way, but unveiled what they called the Plan de San Diego. It was unveiled. What was interesting about it was that it was unveiled in the town of San Diego, Texas. If you didn't know that there's a town of San Diego, Texas, you're forgiven. It has a single stoplight. I've been through there. It's on the road from Alice to Laredo, and there's no reason to stop there. But San Diego was of course, a ranchero community, very deep-rooted descendants of the Nuevo Santander colony, under Spanish rule. And so in 1915, fired by the Carrancista cause, then unfolding in the violence of the Mexican Revolution, these gentlemen decided, under the leadership of a man named Agustin Garza, decided to bring the revolution to South Texas and reclaim the lands lost in the war of 1846 to 1848. For the Mexican nation. And so they issued the Plan de San Diego, and the Plan de San Diego was not a moderate document. I won't read the whole thing to you, it's quite long, but here's two relevant passages. The Plan de San Diego, of course, would involve an insurrection, a rebellion of the Mexicans in South Texas, the ethnic Mexicans in South Texas, and here's what they proposed to do. Every North American Anglo under 16 years of age, over 16 years of age, pardon me, shall be put to death. They were going to kill the entire male population. And only the aged men, women, and children shall be respected, and on no account shall the traitors to our race be spared or respected. So they were going to shoot all the male Anglos, 16 and older, and any Mexican American, any ethnic Mexican who cooperated with them in the name of simple humanity would themselves be killed. Furthermore, prisoners shall not be taken. Instead, they shall be, quote, shot immediately without any pretext. It was to be a war of extermination, proclaimed on January 6, 1916, the Plan de San Diego. Well, what do you think the Texas authorities did? They dispatched the Rangers and took care of business. And yet at the same time, there was a disbelief initially among the authorities within the state government of Texas that such a thing could happen. The Saturday Evening Post, in its August 12, 1916 issue, reported that one of the initial revolutionaries who was caught perpetrating an act of violence, they don't specify what, was hauled before a local magistrate in Jim Hogg County, Texas, and the magistrate decided that he was criminally insane and released him on a $100 bond because he simply didn't believe that something was possible. And yet, think about this. Think about the context. If you were 80 years old, if you were an 80-year-old Texan, Anglo, Tejano, it doesn't really matter. If you were 80 years old on January 6, 1915, here's what you had lived through. Here's what you had witnessed firsthand at age 80 in 1915 when the Plan de San Diego, a war of extermination, was announced in South Texas. You had lived through the Alamo Massacre of 1836, the Goliad Massacre of 1836, the Runaway Scrape of 1836, the Dawson Massacre of 1842, the Vasquez Invasion of 1842, the Wall Invasion of 1842, it's a bad year, the Black Bean Incident of 1843 and the Mier Invasion, the First Cortina War of 1859, the Second Cortina War of 1861, the Las Cuevas War of 1875, the San Elizario Assault War of 1877, and the Garza War of 1891. It had been a continual record of violence, and those are only the major incidents, by the by. The frontier was a violent and bloody place, and what T.R. Fehrenbach described as the collision point of three cultures, Spanish, Anglo, and Indian, was not a peaceful frontier. My friend Dr. Don Fraser at Shriner University likes to say that Texas was the only organically multicultural frontier in the American West, and that's true, but that also came with a great deal of violence. And so we have to understand that when 1915 rolls along, that there is this assumption and this reality that the interface between the United States and Mexico is one of endemic violence and contention, a perpetual contention between two peoples for the land. Now, what happened after that is instructive. The Plan de San Diego unfolds, the state of Texas responds, And then we have a new catalog of violence. I'll read you a shortened, this isn't even the whole catalog of incidents afterwards. You have the Norias Ranch raid of 1915. You have the San Ignacio raid of 1916, which actually featured combat between the Carrancistas and the United States Army. You had the Bright Ranch raid of 1917, the Porvenir massacre perpetrated by Texas Rangers and the U.S. Army against an innocent village of Tejanos out in Presidio County in 1918, and then the Third Battle of Juarez in 1919, in which the United States Army, believe it or not, fought alongside the same Carrancistas who perpetrated the Plan de San Diego 4 years earlier to defeat Vista remnants outside of El Paso. A very confused time, a very violent time. The extent to which this permeated the national consciousness then is forgotten because, of course, the First World War era intervened, and that kind of suffuses the awareness of the period between 1910 and 1920. But we must understand this. Upstairs on the 5th floor of this foundation, in my office on the 3rd floor, I have photographs of a young corporal named Roy Sumter who actually volunteered when the Secretary of War called for volunteers in June 1916 to go defend the United States on the Mexican border. He left his small town of Chatham, Illinois, went south, and served in an artillery unit where he actually saw combat against Carrancista forces in South Texas, a young man from the Midwest. The reason I've got his effects is he is actually my great-great-uncle who was then killed on the Western Front in France the next year. So you can see that this was the norm. It was the historical norm for Texas. Texas was a land that had to be fought for. Something changed in 1920. When the Mexican Revolution concludes, and then when the nature of the relationship between the federal government and the states concludes, we enjoy essentially a century of peace. And we have the border that I grew up with, the U.S.-Mexico relationship that I recall. My family roots are in Laredo and Corpus Christi. And it was essentially pacific. The border was never entirely safe, but it was a place where you could go and you could shop, you could have lunch, you could cross, and so on. And there was a peaceable intercourse that made it possible by the 1990s, really by the 1980s, to envision something like a NAFTA, to envision a three-nation bloc in North America of neighbors, friends, who actually would work together for a common purpose for the prosperity of every community from Point Barrow all the way to the Yucatan. So, since 2006, obviously, that dream has faded considerably. And there are two interpretations before us. And I think the purpose of this gathering is to determine which path we take. One path is the path of the reversion to the norm. We can understand the past near century, from 1920-ish to about 2006, of relative peace as being the exception, a historical interregnum, a holiday from history, which is now closed. And then we must return to the previous status quo of endemic violence. Violence, by the way, even though what I've cataloged is violence affecting Texas, that has always principally afflicted our Mexican neighbors. We've always been the principal victims of it. And so we can look at that, and if that is the case, then we must gird ourselves appropriately. And maybe it is. History is contingent, and no one among us can say for sure that we know what's next. But there's another possibility, which is that we can act in both the United States and Mexico, and Texas and Mexico, to make sure that what may seem a holiday from history becomes the new norm. And perhaps there is a scenario in which Mexicans stand up, Americans stand up, same, and Texans lead the way and say that we're not going back. We're not going back to that catalog of violence. We're not going back to that roster of war and raid upon counter-raid that used to characterize the relationship between our two nations. And that is possible. We're a conservative institution here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Most of you all are conservative here as well. Our partners in the Carballo Dialogue are all conservative, and we're grateful to work with you. One of the roots of conservatism is that we understand human nature. We operate from the reality of the nature of man, the fallen nature of man. But we also know that hope abides, else there would be no purpose in our work. And our hope is that things like the U.S.-Mexico Policy Summit, the connections and the friendships that have formed even in this day, can form the foundation of a truly peaceful relationship, and the greatness of both nations can express themselves fully in partnership as neighbors rather than rivals. Let me close with this. For those of you who have been to Mexico City, and if you've never been, I encourage you to go. There's been a lot of criticism of Mexico in this room today, a lot of it from me, but I want to tell you something, that Mexico City, for my money, is the greatest city in the hemisphere. It really is. It is a treasure. Just to imagine that you can fly from Austin in 90 minutes and be in a city with Renaissance architecture, tremendous culture, profound culinary delights, just one of the most extraordinary cities I have ever seen. I went there for the first time in 2011, and my exposure to the border had been Nuevo Laredo, my friends. Mexico City is something very different. It's very, very good. And so you think about it, one of the jewels of Mexico City is the Museo Sumaya, which is Carlos Slim's museum. Is that right? Yeah. So Carlos Slim, he built it with the cash in his couch cushions. And in the Museo Sumaya, there is a painting. It was so striking. When I rounded the corner and saw it, I gasped. It was that striking of a piece of art. It's by an artist named Jorge González Camarena. It's a 1980 painting, and so it doesn't appear in any art history books. It's not a particular note, but it was of note to me because of what it expressed. And let me describe the painting to you, and then I'll tell you the title of it. For those of you who've seen it, don't give it away. But the painting is this: it has a Spanish conquistador, and he's in a grip with an Aztec warrior, and their faces are obscured. You can see the helmets and kind of the armor, and each man is running a sword through the other. Each man is killing the other, and the name of the painting is El Abrazo. It's El Abrazo. It's the embrace. And so Camarena is trying to express what he sees as this fusion, the dos culturas, that creates the Mexican nation, Spanish and the Indígena, the Aztec, and it struck me so much because it's such a pessimistic and grim and frankly moving a work of art. What a view! What a view for the origin of your nation. And here's my wish. Texas and the United States and Mexico are also locked in an abrazo. And we have it within our power to decide what the artists of the next century will paint of that relationship. Whether it's two opposing cultures, nevertheless creating a synthesis, running swords through one another, or whether it is a true abrazo de amigos. Thank you all for coming. You've come from such a long way. We're very grateful.